Yes, coach. Yes, coach. Yes. 3, 2, 1, Jayhawks! The ball comes into Brown. 3. He goes around. He dribbles around. He's at the top of the key. 2, 1. He's up. It's up. Oh, I hope that doesn't hit the light. He misses. It's off the rim. But wait. There's a whistle on the play. It was a foul. He gets 3 shots for the championship. Brown's going to the line. If he hits 2 out of 3, they win it all. Anybody else ever have a fantasy like that growing up? Now I know that it's supposed to go in, but for me, when I would go out back on the, in our basketball hoop in our backyard, and I'd play that scenario over and over and over again, come back, take the shot. It's supposed to go in. But it didn't go in very often for me, so I had to come up with a different scenario, and that different scenario usually had to do with I got fouled or somebody else did something wrong, so I got a little bit of extra time and a second opportunity. The fantasy, obviously, for me, stayed that way. The dream died my sophomore year of high school. That's when I realized that basketball wasn't going to be my future. This Sunday, I'm really excited to be participating in something that's going on movement-wide across the Church of God. For those of you who don't know a lot about how the Church of God operates, they don't tell us this is what you're going to teach on each and every week. They don't move pastors around and tell us this is where you're going to be the pastor. That's not how things work. But every now and then, the Church of God offices will kind of encourage certain things. We've been encouraged to teach, obviously certain things during Christmas time. We teach about Christmas. But they'll send out different devotionals and they'll send out different ideas and things like that. I was really excited when a couple of months ago we went to Church of God camp meeting up in Anderson. It had returned to Anderson. Yes, Indiana is the home base of Church of God Anderson, which is what we are a part of. And they got up and they began to talk about this day called Sunday. A day where they were inviting pastors to stand up in front of the congregations and to just share our call to ministry, but also to talk about what a call is. And what really makes me excited about that is not an opportunity to share with you my story or anything like that, but it's because what the Church of God is seeing and what we are seeing across the nation and across the world is that God is doing something big. If you pay attention, when Chip Taylor was here from Intern Academy, I think a couple of months ago now, he got up and he shared some pretty discouraging stats as far as the number of pastors that are going to retire in the next 5 to 10 years and how there's not the pastors coming up to replace them. But what we're starting to see is more and more young people feeling and answering a call to ministry. And the Church of God Ministries has begun to see that this big thing is happening, that God is getting ready to do a big move, we believe. But at the same time, there's not the people who are, more and more young people are saying yes, but there's still not enough. People willing to say, I feel that call, I hear that call, and I'm going to say yes to that call. So I'm excited about this happening. It's not every church is going to participate in it, not every Church of God movement, because again, they don't tell us you have to do this, but they encourage it. And as soon as I heard them say that, I was like, absolutely, we're going to participate in that. See, it was actually a couple weeks ago, Lori Williams got up here and she shared about call a little bit and having a calling on our life. That was actually, it wasn't an assignment that I gave her. I asked her, I really believed that God was saying, Lori is the one who's supposed to speak when you're gone. I was in Oklahoma a couple of weeks ago. And so I asked her if she would speak, and I said, hey, sometimes I've got some ideas and direction as to, where we're headed as a congregation, if we're in a series or whatever it might be, or sometimes it's even an individual person. They have a story or they have a teaching that they are just particularly gifted for, and I see that and I ask them to step into that. On this one, I said, Lori, I really don't have that. God's not telling me that. I really believe that God's got something for your heart, and He's going to tell you what it is. And she came to me a week later and said, so here's where I believe God has taken me in this. I believe that we're supposed to talk about calling. And I sat there and I went, that's incredible, because on August 9th, we're getting up to do this Called Sunday thing, and we're going to talk about calling. So I'm not up here this morning to correct anything that Lori had to say. I'm not up here to go deeper or further. I'm here this morning to continue the conversation from what Lori began to introduce to us just 2 weeks ago. She mentioned that 225 times in the New Testament, we have this word calling or called or the call show up throughout it, which means if it's showing up 225 times, the New Testament's actually the shorter testament. If it's showing up that many times, it's probably something that we should pay attention to. It's something that's important. It's something that God often does. I don't have like this perfect definition of this is what a calling is. People ask me often to describe a calling to them. And truthfully, depending on the person that I'm talking to or the situation that I'm in or the reason that they're asking the question, the answer could be a little bit different. Not that it's a different answer, but that the way I'm describing it in that moment is a little bit different. I hope that makes sense. I'm not like making up something different for everybody. So I don't have a definition for you this morning, but the way that I would describe this morning a calling, because I know that can be a confusing concept, is that a calling is where your dreams and your purpose collide. It's that spot where those dreams that are inside of you that maybe you had as a child, maybe you've had more recently, and the very clear purpose that God has for your life, they come together and it begins to show you what you're supposed to do with that. Now, I want to be very clear that dreams and fantasies are two very different things. For me, the dream of playing in the NBA, that was, look, I know people can say, don't give up on yourself and try really hard and why, all these things. I was never going to be an NBA player. It was never going to happen. When this was the tallest I got, and I hit it by like 8th or 9th grade, something like that, it became pretty clear I was no Muggsy Bogues, the shortest player to ever play in the NBA. I did not have his talent or his athletic ability or his drive, that the NBA was not my future. That was a fantasy for me, probably about as much of a fantasy of, hey, I really want to fly, and so I'm going to jump off my roof and flap my arms. I think I would probably have a better chance of flying that way than I ever had of being in the NBA. That was a fantasy for me. Fantasies are fine, especially when we're kids. We should have those types of things, those dreams that are like, hey, I know it says that I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Well, some things he doesn't give us strength to do. Let's just put it that way. He did not give me the strength to play in the NBA or to jump off my roof and fly. In fact, I believe he would look at me when I, got up to those pearly gates and he'd be like, that was dumb. That wasn't going to work. But there are dreams that we have that there actually is something deeper behind them. See, I had other dreams beyond being an NBA player. At one point in my life, I dreamed of being a lawyer. I've shared this with you before, that I loved reading John Grisham books. I loved watching a lot of law shows, although ironically, Law and Order, never interested in it. I loved hearing those stories and hearing the law pieces come out in them. And I even at one point spent some time doing, we called it in Kansas, debate, where it was actually a school-organized club that you could be a part of, competition you could be a part of. I loved the opportunity to get up and to argue my point and to try and, to win the cases or whatever. But I had this dream of being a lawyer, much like the dad in the Nancy Drew books, which I don't know if anybody else ever read those, but I enjoyed them. Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, loved those books. The dad in the Nancy Drew books was a lawyer who would defend the poor, and he would defend the needy, and he would defend the people who couldn't otherwise afford a lawyer. That was his purpose in life. That was the job that he had, and I would read about that, and I know for a lot of people that might sound weird because the books were supposed to be about the cases that Nancy Drew was investigating, but I would love hearing about what he would do, and I wanted to do something like that until I realized in debate just how much boring study there is that goes into that. And I don't want to do that part of it. But I loved the idea of helping out those who couldn't otherwise help themselves. There were times in my life where I dreamed of being a teacher. In fact, there have even been moments in my life as a pastor where I've dreamed about leaving being a pastor and becoming a teacher instead, because teachers, please don't get mad at me. But in those moments, being a teacher sounded easier than what I was doing. Now, I know that's not true, but in those moments, yes, Lindy, please don't charge the stage. In those moments, it felt like that would be true. But there was also this element in my life of I wanted so badly to help younger people learn and to help improve the future lives that they had. And so being a teacher was a way to do that. There were different points in my life, especially as a child, where I would watch a war movie or whatever it may be, even a cop show, and I'd want to go out and I'd want to be part of the military, and my friends and I would go out and we'd go on missions in the backyard, and we would go out there to defend the freedoms of our country or our town, or somebody would get hurt, and we'd go out and we would seek justice for them. Like, I wanted to go out and do those, and now they say don't go out and act like you have a gun in your hand and all that kind of stuff because it's teaching, whatever. But I had these dreams of being the military hero. And obviously, none of those dreams happened. I'm not a teacher in the sense of teaching in a school. I'm not a war hero. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a pastor. See, those were my dreams. But God had a purpose for my life. And my purpose, that really we all shared this particular purpose, but my purpose was to spread the gospel. Everywhere I go and every opportunity that I have, that's our purpose as we go about. And I began to see at a very young age, which not everyone experiences this, I did. I began to see at a very young age those dreams and that purpose and how they were going to collide. Now, I didn't understand it all at the time as far as what was going on, but as a young child, both of my grandpas were pastors in the Church of God, 50 plus years, and so I saw their example my entire life. Neither one of my parents themselves became pastors, but they volunteered in the church. We were that family that was there all the time. As I look at my family tree, I see aunts and I see uncles and I see cousins. It's just littered with pastors everywhere I look. And so as a young child, I would look at my parents and I would say, I'm going to be like my grandpas. I'm going to be a pastor someday. It wasn't like this sense of my grandpas are so cool and I just want to be just like them. I mean, they were, I think, anyway. But it wasn't like I just wanted to be like my grandpas. It was God was putting a call on my life, and he was using that as a way for me to see that. Really, I look at my call, and I'm going to use that word a lot today. I apologize. Remember, a call is where your dreams and your purpose collide. That's how we're describing it today. But I would look at my call to be a pastor, and I look back on it, and I see these elements of Samuel in the New Old Testament, books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, where we see Samuel as a young boy being called by God and being told what his future elements of it were going to be. That was my story. I got to hear it as a very young child as far as what this is going to look like. And so I began to kind of step into that a little bit. The other piece that goes along with that purpose piece, I believe, and all these things colliding, is that our purpose is, it's coming out in our talents, and it's coming out in our opportunities. Or maybe I should say our gifts and our opportunities. That I began to be told by others, I'm not saying I always believed, but I began to be told that I had a presence when I was in front of people. That there wasn't that fear that they saw in a lot of other people when they would get up on the platform. I still look at the stats of the number of people who their number one fear is to stand up and do public speaking, and I'm like, I don't get that. I love public speaking. Bring it on. I was told that Cam Ingstrom, who coaches our high school girls soccer, that he did his meeting for the parents in 8 minutes. Mine took 25. Because and it didn't feel like it to me. Now, sometimes, don't get me wrong, sometimes that's a problem. I understand that. But there's never been this fear of standing up in front. My parents stuck me up. They gave me the opportunity from the time that I could speak to be on a platform with a microphone in my hand and begin to sing. And then as I got older and I got into high school, my pastor did this really bold thing, and he gave me a microphone and allowed me to preach. And my youth pastor did this crazy thing, and he allowed me to walk alongside him and actually plan the youth ministry and what things would look like. And so these opportunities began to come along that were within my gifting, that were somehow or another, as I got older, I began to see fulfilling my dreams that I had. Because the dreams weren't really about being a lawyer or being a military hero or being a teacher. The dreams that I had were about helping the poor and the needy and the lost and the helpless. The dreams were about educating young people and over time, educating people who weren't quite so young. And so what I did is I stepped into being a youth pastor. And I did that for 12 years, walking along with those who were lost and helpless and the poor and the needy, and educating the young, equipping the young so that their future lives could be better than the day that they were currently in. The dreams and the purpose collided to pull me into this thing that we call being a pastor. And what I've learned, I knew it, but what I've learned through experience now is that this calling comes with a cost. Recently, several times I've had this opportunity to kind of share, okay, so tell me about yourself. And so I began to tell them about myself and, how I met Sarah and then how we ended up getting married. And it's like, and then we graduated college and we moved to Colorado was first. We moved to Colorado as a youth pastor and we had a kid. And then we moved to Oklahoma as a youth pastor and we had a kid. And then we moved to Wyoming as a youth pastor and we had a kid. And now we've moved to Indiana as a lead pastor and there are no more kids going to happen. And I run through, and that's kind of the story that I walk people through as far as how our family came to be and how all of this happened and everything. But as I look at that story, as exciting as it is and as fun as it is to tell it in that way, and I usually get a little bit of a laugh like that one out of it, at the same time it means that none of my children live in the state where they were born. None of my children live in the home that they first knew. None of my children live within 4 hours of a blood relative. My children don't have that experience and truthfully, we don't know if when they come back home someday, if it'll be back home here or if it'll be somewhere else. People ask me all the time, how long are you going to be in Monroe City? And I say, I don't know. It's not because I have any desires to leave, but it's because my call is to follow where God wants me to be. And everywhere we go, we have the mentality of we are going to be there until God says it's time to go somewhere else. And if that means 4 decades, like Pastor Mark was before me, actually 3.9 decades, or if that means whatever the less number is, then that's what we're going to be. Church, that comes with a cost. There's been a lot of tears of saying goodbye to friends and family over the years. It comes with a cost of, I'm just gonna be honest with it. It's not a financial windfall being a pastor. It's not a get rich type of an occupation, and so there are some costs that come with that. But it also comes with the cost of they're terrible work hours. They really are. I'm not saying that as in like I hate them. But not a lot of jobs, the work hours are Monday morning at 5 a.m. until Monday morning at 5 a.m. of the next week, meaning 24/7. I don't say that as a complaint, but there's a cost that comes with that. There have been those days where we've been in the middle of something as a family and it's like, hey, I got to go. And some of you understand that with the things that you do. It's not that I'm the only person or pastors are the only ones that have that kind of a cost. But when we have a call in our life, it's not just like, hey, you walk into this and everything is perfect. And truthfully, I can't tell you that I always feel fulfilled and I always feel at peace because it also comes with a cost of there are attacks that come along with it. There are spiritual attacks that come hard and they come heavy. In fact, Sunday afternoons are my least favorite time of the entire week. Even though it's a time that I generally get to spend with my family, or at least slowing down, it is the time of the week where I'm sitting there and going, man, that was a really stupid thing to say this morning. I can't believe I said that. Somebody's going to be really upset about that one. Or man, I left that one out. I can't believe I forgot to say that. And it is this constant barrage of you got up there with a microphone and you absolutely failed. And I'm not the only pastor that feels that way. I'm not the only person that steps into a calling that God has put on their life, that the enemy continually comes after them and says, you failed at your call today. It comes with a spiritual attack. It comes with relational attacks. I've sat there in a sanctuary where people in the front of the room and the back of the room were screaming at each other, and I was the topic of conversation. Because some of them really hated me, and some of them really loved me. Or maybe I shouldn't say me. Some of them really hated what I was doing, and some of them really loved what I was doing. And so I know what that feels like. Stepping into a call on your life isn't a guarantee of you are always going to be full of peace and joy. I mean, you will be, but you won't be at the same time. Because the enemy doesn't like it when people do this. And I don't just mean being a pastor. The enemy doesn't like it when people have their dreams and the God-given purpose that he's given them collide, and they step into it and they do what it is that God has called them to do. And yet, it's still exactly what he calls us to do. And that's why the beautiful piece is that the call that we have, they also give us the ability to persevere through all of those things. Yeah, I even tattooed that on my arm to remind myself of that. That when we have a call on our life and when we've stepped into that call, that no matter what those costs are, and no matter how many moments we feel low or we feel down or whatever it is, we have the ability to persevere because we're doing what it is that God has created us and called us into. And truthfully, when we're in that place where our dreams and our purposes collide, we couldn't get away from it if we wanted to. At least not get away from it and feel like our lives were full and feel like we were doing what we were supposed to be doing. When we step into our call, what we're really doing is we're following an example of the one that we claim to follow if we call ourselves Christians. Because Jesus himself had a calling on his life. In Matthew chapter 9, it says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. See, Jesus, we don't know if Jesus grew up dreaming to be a carpenter, if he grew up dreaming to be a rabbi, or if he grew up what those dreams, or a shepherd, what those dreams necessarily were as far as occupation go. But we can glean from what we have about his life that he had a dream as a child, much like mine were with being a lawyer and that type of stuff. He had a dream to help guide those who were lost. And whatever that looked like as a child, we begin to see this, that he doesn't look out at the people and be like, oh man, that really stinks. Somebody else should figure this out for them. He looks out at them and he doesn't sit there and say, man, they're hopeless, or man, whatever. He looks out at them and his heart breaks for them. He has compassion for them. His heart, his dreams are to see them found, to see them walking on the right path. His dreams are to see people walking in step with the Father. And his purpose, we see it in Luke chapter 4 and 18 and 19, when he walks into a synagogue, similar to a church, but not quite the same thing. When he walks in there and he's asked to read from a scroll, and he pulls out Isaiah and he reads these words, that the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The purpose on his life was so abundantly clear that he was put here to proclaim certain things. See, when Jesus got done reading this, he actually puts the scroll down and he says, today you have seen this come true. You have seen this fulfilled in me. I'm the one who came to do these things. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. His dreams were to see people found, to see them back on the right path. And his purpose was to be the one to go around proclaiming how that could happen. And it became his calling, his mission, if you want to call it, to seek and to save the lost, to make disciples, and to build the kingdom. And eventually, we see that there was a cost to that, because the cost led him to a cross. And we see him in the garden not sitting there going, hallelujah, I'm going to a cross tomorrow. But we see the burden of that, and yet at the same time we see that it was the call on his life that was the reason that he was able to persevere through the cross. The call on his life was the reason that he was able to endure that and go through with it so that you and I could be free from sin. It wasn't because he was sitting there and the Father was sitting there saying, son, get on that cross right now. It was nothing like that. It wasn't a command, it wasn't a demand, it wasn't anything. It was he couldn't do anything else. Because he would have known that that wasn't what his calling was. And the second he walked away, he would have known you walked away from your purpose and your dreams colliding. And the contentment that he was hoping for, the happiness that he was hoping for, never would have been there, even though he would have avoided that difficult situation. And then, Jesus, so he died, and he rose, and he ascended, and he said, now you are going to be the ones that are going to carry out the rest of my call. Every follower of Jesus has a calling on their life. Now, I understand that not all followers of Jesus are going to become pastors in the traditional sense, in a vocational sense, that there's a lot of different opportunities to step into the call. He calls us to all sorts of different things. But we do all have a call on our life. In 1 Peter 2:9, Peter, one who was at one point in his life a fisherman and who was called out of that, writes, you are a chosen people, you are royal priests. And he's not just writing that to pastors, he's writing that to everybody, meaning no matter what your job may be, whether you might be in the everyday workplace, you have a call in your life. You are a chosen people. You have been chosen to be the ones to carry out God's mission. Others are called to live their lives, to devote their lives to serving and equipping the church, a vocational call like this. The Apostle Paul, who had a different story before, in Ephesians verses 4 and verse 12 says their responsibility is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. The role of every pastor, whether it be myself as a lead pastor, Courtney as a worship pastor, Mike as a youth pastor, Carrie as a children's pastor, the role of a pastor is to equip the church to go out and to discover and answer their call. To teach people that the call that we have should always mirror God's call. It should always mirror the call that Jesus had on his life, which was to seek and to save the lost. And so the first question that I have for you today is, how is God inviting you to become part of the answer that Jesus prays for the workers? How is God calling you to be the answer to being those people who continue to fulfill that call on Jesus' life? Because don't miss this. Every follower of Jesus is called. Period. Not every follower of Jesus except me is called. Every follower of Jesus. But many who have been called, and this is a statement that it could upset some because it's going to define some of us in this room. Many who are called have not answered with a yes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 9 that the harvest is great and the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest and ask him to send more workers into his fields. The harvest is great, but the workers are few because so many, God has put a call on their life and they said, nah, For some, they say no to the call simply by ignoring it or running away from it. They're like Jonah that we read about in the Old Testament. Not Jonah Rush, but Jonah in the Old Testament, the one who, we talk about how he got swallowed by a fish. No, it was a whale. No, it was just a big giant thing in the ocean. No, regardless, no matter what it looks like, Jonah heard a call from God to go to a place called Nineveh, and he said, no. And he ran the other way. We run the other way when God puts a call on our life because sometimes we say, there's not enough money in that call. I'm not going to be able to have the things that I want in that call, or I'm going to run away, or I'm going to ignore it because, God, I don't like those people. That's why Jonah ran. Jonah looked at Nineveh and said, those are terrible people. And for some, God has put a call on our life to go to a certain group of people, and we say, I don't like them. And so we go the other way, or maybe we've just found comfort in our lives as they currently are. And so we're just going to ignore and act like we didn't hear that call. Because if I answer that call, I'm going to have to give up some of what I already have. Some people say no because they're too busy making excuses. They're like Moses that we run across in the Old Testament, that guy that God called to say, you're going to go back to Egypt and you're going to free the people from Israel. And I'm going to tell you this through a burning bush, which personally, if I'm talking to a bush that's burning and it doesn't even matter if the bush is burning up. If I'm talking to a bush, period, and it's actually talking to me, once I get past the fact of, no, I'm not insane, this is actually happening, and this bush is telling me to do something, but Moses, he looks at it and he's probably thinking, I already have a job. I'm a shepherd. Or maybe he's making the excuse in his mind, we don't read it, but maybe he's making the excuse in his mind, like, dude, I'm bush. As much as I respect you, I'm 80 years old. What do you want me to do? But what we hear him say is, I'm not good enough to do that. I have a stutter, and I can't go out there and talk. I'm not good with this stuff. And he begins to make excuses. He's talking to a flipping burning bush, and he's making excuses because he's not going to be good enough on his own. We still do it. We make excuses for why we can't do the thing that God has called us to do. Maybe God's called you to be a Kids Hope mentor, and you're sitting there going, I don't even know how to start talking to one of these kids. I don't even know where to begin with that. I don't have children of my own, or my children are all grown, or man, I have these difficulties. I don't understand this generation. I don't understand half the word. What is this whole 6-7 thing all about? And we go, I'm not going to do this because I don't even know where to start. And we make excuse after excuse after excuse when God's saying, hey, I've given you this call in your life and I need you to say yes. But like Moses, we make excuses. Or some of us, we say no because we're confused by what it is that we're hearing. We're like Samuel in the Old Testament, from 1st and 2nd Samuel, that guy. Whereas a little kid, he hears God speaking to him and he runs into Eli, his trainer, his mentor, whatever you want to call him. He runs in and says, yes, what do you need, Eli? And Eli's like, dude, I didn't say anything. Go back to bed. And he goes back to bed and he hears his voice again. He runs into Eli and he's like, hey, what do you need? He's like, I didn't say anything. Leave me alone. I'm trying to sleep. Parents can relate to this. And it happens again, and finally he comes in and Eli's like, hey, it's not me. I think God's trying to say something to you. And he goes back and he hears the voice and he begins to understand that God is talking to him. We end up confused so many times because we're trying to figure this all out on our own. And what we see with Samuel is that sometimes we need that mentor in our lives who's going to help us figure it out. But instead, we're like, no, I'm smart enough. I can do this. I can Google what I just heard that voice in my head saying. I guarantee you, if you go on Google and you say, I heard a voice in my head tell me such and such, it's not going to say, hey, maybe that's God talking to you. It's probably going to say, you need to book an appointment with your psychiatrist and figure out what's going on there. But those who say yes to the call get to live out their dreams with purpose. There's a lot of reasons to say no. There's a lot of ways that we say no. But when we say yes to a call that God has put on our life, we get to live. Again, like I said, I don't always feel fulfilled in every single moment, but I get to live knowing that I'm doing what God has asked me to do. And I personally don't know of any better feeling that I could find. God called an 80-year-old shepherd in Moses to a second career. He was a shepherd at that point. He'd already tried the whole freeing his people thing, and that didn't work, and so he ran away and he got a different job. And God said, no, that was the right job. You just didn't do it the right way. And Moses ended up going back. And maybe there's some of you sitting here in this room, maybe you're 80, and God's calling you to something, and you're thinking, nah. And maybe you need to go read Moses' story. Or maybe you're not 80 yet, but you're in a career, and you feel strongly, you know strongly, you're sensing strongly, whatever word you want to use, that God is saying, hey, that career was for a time, but it's not for forever. Mike wasn't always a pastor. Courtney wasn't always a pastor. In fact, when I moved here, Courtney was a physical therapist. Yes. As soon as I was saying that, I was like, that doesn't sound right, but yeah. And God called her out of physical therapy and called her into this thing that we call ministry. He called a queen in Esther to take a big, big risk. At a time when women were no more than property, he called her to come before the king and to save her people, to save the Jewish people. He called a teenager in Mary, and when she said yes, she became the mother of the one that we now know as the Savior of the world. He called a married fisherman named Peter, and Peter became the one that he eventually said, upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. Peter became one of the first leaders of the church. He already had a career and he already had a family. And yet God redirected us, not away from his family, but God redirected his life when he said yes. He called a hated tax collector by the name of Matthew. And Matthew, thanks to him, we have one of our 4 gospel accounts. He called a devoted anti-Christian named Saul. And thanks to Saul saying yes, we now have half of our New Testament. And we have so many words of wisdom and guidance for the church and for the followers of Christ. Because God calls us out of any life circumstance and out of any stage of life. He doesn't sit there and say, okay, you've already started down this path, now I'm not going to worry about you anymore. But God continually calls people in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. There's a lot of reasons that we say no or we just simply miss a call. But I'm wondering if today there are some who are sitting here that could God be calling you to take the next step in his mission? Now, maybe you are in the exact occupation that you're supposed to be. But maybe God's been calling you to go and to serve his kingdom in a non-vocational ministry capacity. And you've been hearing that, and you've been ignoring it or running from it, or you're confused by it. Maybe that's you. Or maybe you're similar to how Courtney was, and you've got a career lined up, but you know God's calling you out of that career. It's a scary situation. And while I don't know what it's like to switch careers other than going from a youth pastor to a lead pastor, which, while different, is also the same, I do know what it's like to be in a place where you're comfortable and enjoying it and have friends everywhere, and God says it's time to go somewhere else. And I know the temptation to say, nah, not me. Call somebody else. Call somebody else to Southern Indiana. I didn't even know there was a Southern Indiana, God. I thought it was just Indiana. Maybe God's calling you out of where you currently are, and he's calling you into something new, where your passion, your purpose, and your dreams, you're finally going to see them fully collide. Maybe, and I'm not saying it's always the case, maybe that's why you're miserable where you are. It's because God's saying, I've got something different for you. And if you'll say yes to that, you'll see a transformation in your life. Young people, I know that when we have career aptitude tests, or really even when you're talking to a lot of people in the church, it's very rare that you'll hear someone say, have you ever thought about being a pastor? We encourage you to become doctors and teachers, and around here you hear a lot of people encourage you to become a farmer or whatever it may be. But you don't often hear people encourage you to, hey, maybe God's called you to be a pastor. I was asked on a panel one time by a bunch of pastors why it is that this younger generation isn't stepping into the ministry as often as 2 generations ago. My generation didn't have a lot of them either. I said, well, I think at the time, I think the big reason is, when was the last time you heard a pastor talk about the joys of being a pastor? All we ever talk about is how little money you make and how much you have to move and how much people hate you when you do it. Like, that's not a great selling point. I understand that. But as I've considered that question more since then, I've thought, when was the last time that we as the church actually equipped young people to become pastors and encouraged them to become pastors? That we've seen a gifting that God has put on their life, and instead of finding every other possible way that they could use it, we actually say, maybe God's calling you to be one who's going to equip the next generation of followers of Jesus. And there's a lot of different reasons we do that. I have sat there as a youth pastor seeing a clear call on a young person's life and heard their parent, who is a lover of Jesus, say, don't do that, you won't make money. I've heard pastors tell their own children, don't do this because you won't make enough money. And it breaks my heart, because the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few. And so my final question for you today is, are you open to His call on your life for the sake of the world? Because the world needs followers of Jesus to answer the call. Whatever it may be. I know that not everyone in here is going to be called to vocational ministry, but I think there's probably some. I mean, we've actually seen some of our younger people begin to answer that call. I think there's more. I really do. But I also think that we have a lot of people in here who God's saying, no, your career is right where it needs to be, but your service in the kingdom, you're not saying yes. You're making excuses, or you're ignoring it, or you're just confused. And so I want to invite you today, as you consider those questions, to spend some time in prayer. Talk to God. Literally talk to Him. Use your words. Use your mouth. Talk to Him. He can hear that. It doesn't have to be in your head. And say, God, what have you called me to do? What are you wanting me to do? Where have you designed me for my dream and my purpose to collide? What does that look like for you, God? And then take the next step and listen to His answer. We struggle with that one. We love to ask questions. We don't so much love to listen after we ask them. But stay quiet and listen to what He has to say, and then don't ignore what it is that the Holy Spirit is telling you in that moment and over those weeks and months that the answer is coming. But don't stop there. I cannot encourage you strongly enough to find somebody to walk through it with you. As your pastor, I would love to walk through that with you. I would love to sit down and pray with you and talk with you and mentor you through that. Or I would love to offer up any one of your other pastors to walk through that and pray through that with you. But there's also so many spiritually mature people in this congregation that could do that with you as well. Don't try and just figure it all out on your own. All through Scripture we see that people talk to their elders, they talk to their mentors, and their mentors help them figure this thing out. Do that. You also have in your handouts this little single piece of paper, and it's got some QR codes on it. It's got some next steps on it. I'd encourage you, if you're sitting here this morning and you're willing and going to ask those questions, and seriously consider, even if you love your job, you're still going to say, but God, is this where you want? I just want to double check. There are some great resources on this paper. And as we move forward, we're going to spend some time actually inviting you to come together, for everyone to come together who wants to spend some time discovering our calls, to help equip you, not just so that we can get all the volunteers that we need, but so that each individual in this congregation can step into the call that God has on their lives. We're inviting Indiana Ministries to come down. We don't have the date set, but they're going to take us through a calling lab, which is going to be a 5-hour experience, intensive experience, walking through this very thing. Because I understand that a call from God can be terrifying, a call from God can be confusing, a call from God can be countercultural, it can be all those things. But I also understand that there is no greater life than the life that steps into the call that God has put on it. Would you pray with me? God, I thank you that this is not just a Monroe City Church of God thing this morning, but that this is a movement-wide thing that we are seeing that, God, it's easy to look out at our world and to see that this area is falling apart and this area is falling apart and people are fighting over this and they're fighting over that and people are making these claims that are so counter-biblical and it's so easy to get discouraged and all of that. But God, that I believe your words that the harvest is plentiful, that people are searching for truth and they need people who are willing to step into the call that you have put on their life in order to show them that truth. And so, God, as I pray so often, I pray that you would use Monroe City Church of God as being one source of that truth and that light in the world around us. But God, I'm also thankful that you are using the Church of God movement to do that. And I'm thankful for these young people that we are seeing say yes. And God, I pray that you would use us to help equip even more to step into that. Amen.